Aunt Amo, your son's causing trouble again. Sergeant Rodriguez burst into the armory at Fort Wallace, his mocking voice echoing through the space that reeked of gun oil and cold metal. Carol Mitchell stopped checking the safety on the last M4 rifle, looking up from the weapon she'd just finished cleaning. What about Marcus? Rodriguez threw a cracked military ID card onto the concrete floor. Gone AWOL. Abandoned his post at Charlie Ammunition Depot since 2347 last night. Nothing left but blood on the floor and this. Carol Ann picked up her son's ID, her fingers trembling slightly. 5 years of hiding. 5 years of living like a normal person. And now the conspiracy she thought she'd buried was dragging Marcus into it. My son would never go AWOL, she said, her voice cold as ice. Rodriguez laughed mockingly. Then explain why he disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving behind a puddle of blood? But what Rodriguez didn't know was the way Carolyn held that M4, not like a cleaning lady, but like an operative. And right now, security cameras were recording every movement she made, until one small detail would change everything. The morning briefing room at Fort Wallace buzzed with tension as more than 30 military personnel filled the metal folding chairs. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across faces still groggy from the early wake-up call. Major Stevens, a tall man with graying temples and 3 rows of ribbons on his dress uniform, strode to the front of the room carrying a thick manila folder. "Listen up, people," Stevens announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversations. "We have a situation that requires immediate attention. Private Marcus Mitchell, age 19, enlisted personnel assigned to logistics support, has been classified as absent without leave, effective 0600 hours this morning." A collective murmur rippled through the room. AWOL cases weren't uncommon, but they usually involved troublemakers, not quiet logistics personnel who kept their heads down and did their jobs. Furthermore, Stevens continued, opening the folder and pulling out official documents. Due to the circumstances surrounding his disappearance and potential security implications, this case is being handled at the command level. Private Mitchell's file is now sealed, and the matter is considered closed pending further investigation. From the back of the room, a hand shot up. Carol Mitchell had slipped in through the rear entrance, still wearing her maintenance coveralls with Fort Wallace Facilities embroidered on the chest pocket. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face showed the weathered lines of someone who had spent years working with her hands. "Excuse me, sir," Carolyn said, standing slowly. "With respect, my son Marcus would never abandon his post. He called me at 22:30 hours last night to report suspicious activity around the ammunition storage areas. He was concerned about inventory discrepancies he'd noticed during his routine checks." The room fell silent. Officers and enlisted personnel turned to stare at the middle-aged cleaning woman who had just challenged a major's official briefing. Stevens's jaw tightened visibly. "Ma'am," Stevens said, his tone dripping with condescension, "I understand this is difficult for you as a mother, but military personnel don't report classified security matters to their civilian parents. Your son violated multiple protocols and fled when faced with the consequences." Laughter erupted from several soldiers in the front rows. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had delivered the bad news to Carolyn earlier, shook his head with amusement. "Aunt Amo thinks she knows military procedure better than we do," he whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear. The nickname stung, as it always did. For 5 years, since she'd started working as a maintenance cleaner at Fort Wallace, the soldiers had called her Aunt Amo because of her obsessive attention to detail when cleaning weapons in the armory. They thought it was endearing, this middle-aged woman who treated every rifle like it was a precision instrument instead of just another piece of equipment to be maintained. "Sir," Carolyn pressed on, ignoring the snickers, "I know my son. He's been fascinated by military logistics since he was 12 years old. He enlisted because he wanted to serve, not because he was running from anything. Marcus would never—" "That's enough." Stevens slammed the folder shut with enough force to make several people jump. "Mrs. Mitchell, I sympathize with your situation, but you are a civilian contractor with no security clearance and no authority to question official military findings. Your son abandoned his post. Period. End of discussion." More laughter filled the room, but this time it had an uncomfortable edge. Lieutenant Cole, a lean man in his early 30s sitting in the second row, studied Carolyn's face carefully. Something about her reaction bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. Furthermore, Stevens continued, any civilian interference in this matter will be considered obstruction of a military investigation and dealt with accordingly. I trust I make myself clear. Carolyn nodded once, a sharp, economical movement that somehow managed to convey both acknowledgement and defiance. Crystal clear, sir. As the briefing disbanded, soldiers filed out in small groups, their conversations a mix of speculation about the AWOL case and crude jokes about Aunt Amo's dramatic intervention. Carolyn remained in her seat until the room emptied, then made her way to the front where Stevens was gathering his papers. Major Stevens, she said quietly, I'd like permission to examine the scene where my son was last seen. Stevens looked up with barely concealed irritation. Absolutely not. The ammunition depot is a restricted area, and you have no business. I clean that facility twice a week, Carolyn interrupted. I have facility maintenance clearance for all storage areas. I know every inch of those buildings, and I might notice something your investigators missed. Mrs. Mitchell, Stevens said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper, let me be very clear about something. Your son was involved in activities that compromised base security. The fact that he ran instead of facing the consequences tells us everything we need to know about his guilt. Any attempt by you to interfere with this investigation will result in the immediate termination of your contract and possible criminal charges. Do I make myself understood? Carolyn met his gaze steadily. I understand perfectly, sir. But as she turned to leave, Stevens caught sight of something that made him pause. The way she pivoted on the ball of her foot, the automatic scan of the room's exits, the slight adjustment of her posture that put her weight on both feet in perfect balance. These weren't the movements of a cleaning lady. They were the reflexes of someone with tactical training. Lieutenant Cole lingered near the door, pretending to check his phone while watching Carolyn leave. 5 years ago, fresh out of West Point, he'd been assigned to a joint training exercise with special operations personnel. He'd spent 6 weeks learning from some of the most elite soldiers in the American military, and one thing they'd all shared was a particular way of moving through space. Economical, purposeful, always ready. Carol Mitchell moved exactly like that. The walk from the briefing room to Charlie Ammunition Depot took Carolyn through the heart of Fort Wallace. The base sprawled across nearly 8,000 acres of North Carolina pine forest, a sprawling complex of buildings that housed everything from basic training facilities to advanced weapons research. Established during World War II, Fort Wallace had evolved into one of the Army's primary logistics hubs, responsible for storing and distributing ammunition to military installations across the southeastern United States. Carolyn had walked these same paths for 5 years, invisible to most of the soldiers who passed her every day. They saw what they expected to see, a middle-aged civilian employee who cleaned their facilities and maintained their equipment. They had no idea she could identify the make and model of every weapon in the armory just by the sound it made when the action cycled. They didn't know she automatically cataloged the tactical gear worn by every soldier she passed, noting modifications and wear patterns that told stories about deployment history and operational experience. Most importantly, they had no idea that Marcus Mitchell, the quiet logistics specialist who had supposedly gone AWOL, was the only person in the world who knew his mother's real identity, or thought he did. Charlie Depot sat at the eastern edge of the base, a cluster of reinforced concrete bunkers surrounded by razor wire and motion sensors. The buildings were designed to contain explosions rather than prevent them, with thick walls and lightweight roofs that would direct any blast upward instead of outward. During Carolyn's twice-weekly cleaning visits, she'd memorized every detail of the facility's layout, from the main storage areas down to the locations of every security camera and motion detector. As she approached the main gate, Sergeant First Class Williams emerged from the guard shack. A stocky man with 20 years of service, Williams had always been respectful to Carolyn, treating her like the professional she appeared to be rather than the nuisance some soldiers considered her. "Morning, Mrs. Mitchell," Williams said, his usual friendly demeanor noticeably subdued. "I heard about Marcus. I'm real sorry about the whole situation." "Thank you, Sergeant Williams," Carolyn replied. "I was hoping to take a look at the scene where he was last seen. I know the facility better than anyone except the regular staff, and I might spot something that was missed." Williams shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I'd like to help, but I got orders from Major Stevens himself. No unauthorized personnel in the depot until the investigation is complete. That includes maintenance staff." "I understand," Carolyn said, but her eyes were already scanning the fence line, noting the locations where the razor wire had been recently repaired and the sight lines from the guard towers. "Can you at least tell me what was found? As his mother, I think I have a right to know." Williams glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. "Look, between you and me, something about this whole thing doesn't smell right. Your boy was scheduled for a routine inventory check on Building 7. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. But when the morning shift arrived, they found blood near the ammunition racks and Marcus's gear scattered on the floor. No sign of forced entry, no indication of a struggle beyond that blood." "What kind of blood pattern?" Carolyn asked, the question coming out more clinical than she'd intended. Williams gave her a strange look. "Blood pattern? Ma'am, I don't know what you mean by that." Carolyn caught herself, forcing her expression back to that of a worried mother rather than someone with forensic training. I just meant, was there a lot of blood? Was it like he was badly hurt?" Military police said it looked like a head wound. Not fatal, but enough to cause some bleeding. They think maybe Marcus hit his head when he was gathering up supplies to run. "What supplies?" "That's the thing," Williams said, lowering his voice even further. "Nothing was missing from the inventory. Not a single round of ammunition, not even a cleaning kit. If Marcus was planning to desert, why didn't he take anything with him? And where's his vehicle?" "His car is still in the parking lot with his personal gear in the trunk." These details painted a picture that had nothing to do with desertion and everything to do with foul play. But Carolyn kept her expression neutral, filing away every piece of information for later analysis. "Sergeant Williams," she said carefully, "in your professional opinion, does this really look like an AWOL situation?" Williams was quiet for a long moment, studying Carolyn's face. "Ma'am, in my professional opinion, your son didn't run away. Something happened to him in that building, and whoever's responsible cleaned up most of the evidence before calling it in." As Carolyn walked back toward the main base, her mind automatically began processing the information Williams had shared. Blood near the ammunition racks suggested Marcus had been standing in a specific location when he was attacked. The lack of defensive wounds or signs of struggle indicated either a surprise attack or an assault by someone Marcus trusted. The absence of missing equipment ruled out theft as a motive, which meant Marcus had discovered something he wasn't supposed to see. Most telling of all was the timing. Marcus had called her at 22:30 hours to report suspicious activity. The official timeline showed him missing as of 23:47 hours, just 77 minutes later. That was barely enough time for a deserter to pack essential supplies and make travel arrangements, but it was exactly the right amount of time for someone to clean up a crime scene and establish an alibi. Lost in thought, Carolyn almost missed the black SUV that had been following her since she left the ammunition depot. The vehicle maintained a careful distance, staying back far enough to avoid suspicion, but close enough to keep her in sight. Professional surveillance, the kind that required training and coordination. Someone was very interested in Carolyn Mitchell's activities, and that someone had resources. She led her tail on a circuitous route through the base, stopping occasionally to check building maintenance schedules and chat with other civilian employees. To anyone watching, she appeared to be going about her normal work routine, but Carolyn was actually conducting a counter-surveillance operation, using reflective surfaces and changes in direction to identify her followers and assess their capabilities. 2 vehicles, rotating positions every few minutes. At least 4 personnel, probably more. Radio coordination based on the timing of their movements. This wasn't some hastily organized surveillance operation thrown together by base security. This was a professional intelligence gathering effort, the kind mounted against high-value targets. The implications were chilling. Whoever had taken Marcus knew exactly who his mother was, and they were treating her as a legitimate threat despite her civilian cover identity. That meant her real background had been compromised, which shouldn't have been possible unless someone with extremely high security clearance had access to classified personnel files. Files that were supposed to have been destroyed 5 years ago. Carolyn's first instinct was to lose the surveillance team and begin her own investigation using methods that would definitely blow her cover. But she forced herself to think like a mother instead of an operative. If she revealed her true capabilities too early, it might force whoever had Marcus to accelerate their timeline. Better to let them think they were dealing with a grieving civilian while she gathered intelligence on their operation. The base gymnasium at Fort Wallace buzzed with afternoon activity as soldiers finished their mandatory physical training. Carolyn had timed her arrival perfectly. Knowing that Lieutenant Cole would be here supervising a weapons familiarization class for newly arrived personnel, she needed to gather more information about the official investigation, and Cole seemed like the most approachable of the officers involved in Marcus's case. She found him in the armory adjacent to the main gym, watching as a group of young soldiers practiced field-stripping M4 rifles under the supervision of a grizzled staff sergeant. Cole stood with his arms crossed, occasionally offering corrections or encouragement, but his attention seemed divided. "Lieutenant Cole?" Carolyn approached carefully, her posture and tone designed to project worried mother rather than potential threat. "I'm Carolyn Mitchell, Marcus's mother. Could I speak with you for a moment?" Cole turned, and Carolyn caught the brief flash of recognition in his eyes, not just of her identity, but of something deeper. He'd been studying her, probably since the morning briefing. "Of course, Mrs. Mitchell," Cole said. "I'm sorry about your son. This whole situation must be very difficult for you." "It is," Carolyn replied. "I was hoping you might be able to tell me more about the investigation. I know Major Stevens said the case was closed, but surely there must be some ongoing effort to locate Marcus." Cole glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then gestured toward a quiet corner of the armory. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want to be straight with you. There are aspects of this case that don't add up, and I've expressed those concerns to my superiors." "What kind of aspects?" "The timeline, for one thing. Your son's last confirmed contact was at 22:30 hours when he called you. Security cameras show him entering Building 7 at 23:15 hours, but there's no footage of him leaving. The cameras went offline between 23:40 and 00:15 hours due to what's being called a routine maintenance window." Carolyn's expression didn't change, but internally she was processing the implications. Security cameras didn't go offline for routine maintenance during active operations periods. Someone with administrative access had deliberately disabled the surveillance system to prevent their activities from being recorded. "Have the investigators examined the footage from before the cameras went down?" she asked. "That's where things get interesting," Cole said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "According to the official report, no useful footage exists. But I was able to review the preliminary analysis before it was classified, and there were some unusual details. Such as?" Cole hesitated, clearly wrestling with how much information he should share with a civilian. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "Your son wasn't alone in that building. The thermal imaging shows at least 3 other individuals present during the 30 minutes before the cameras went offline. All of them were wearing military uniforms, and their movement patterns suggested they were familiar with the facility layout." This confirmed Carolyn's suspicions about inside involvement, but it also raised new questions. 3 individuals was a significant operational footprint for what should have been a simple abduction or elimination. Either they needed multiple people to control Marcus, or they were planning something more complex than just silencing a witness. "Lieutenant," Caroline said carefully, "in your professional opinion, does this look like a desertion case?" Cole studied her face for several seconds before answering. "Mrs. Mitchell, in my professional opinion, your son stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see, and now he's either being held somewhere or—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Or what?" "Or whoever took him decided it was safer to make him disappear permanently." The words hit Carolyn like a physical blow, not because she hadn't considered the possibility, but because hearing it spoken aloud by someone else made it real. For 5 years, she'd lived with the knowledge that her past might eventually catch up with her. She'd just never imagined it would come for Marcus first. "Is there anything I can do to help the investigation?" she asked. "I know the base facilities better than most people, and I have maintenance access to areas that might be relevant." Cole's expression grew cautious. "Mrs. Mitchell, I appreciate your willingness to help, but this is an active military investigation. Civilian involvement could complicate things legally. What if I noticed something during my normal work routine? Something that might be relevant but wasn't specifically part of an investigation?" It was a careful question, designed to establish plausible deniability for any intelligence-gathering activities she might need to conduct. Cole seemed to understand the subtext, and after a moment of consideration, he nodded slowly. "If you happen to notice anything unusual during your regular maintenance duties, I suppose it would be your civic duty to report it to the appropriate authorities. As Carol left the gymnasium, she was acutely aware that the surveillance team had picked up her trail again. This time, however, she noticed something new. One of the vehicles was now positioned to cover the route between her apartment and Marcus's barracks, while another had taken up a position near the base's main gate. They weren't just watching her, they were preparing to intercept her if she tried to leave Fort Wallace. That level of preparation suggested they were expecting her to make a move soon, which meant they probably had intelligence about her background that went beyond what appeared in her official civilian personnel file. Someone had done their homework on Carol Mitchell, and they knew she was more dangerous than she appeared. The question was, how much did they know, and how had they learned it? Her apartment in the civilian housing area of Fort Wallace was a modest two-bedroom unit that she'd chosen specifically for its location and sight lines. From her kitchen window, she could observe traffic on the main road leading to the base's restricted areas. From her bedroom, she had a clear view of the parking lot and two potential escape routes. She had furnished the place to look like the home of a middle-aged single mother, but hidden throughout the apartment were tools and equipment that told a very different story. Inside a false bottom in her bedroom dresser, wrapped in waterproof plastic, were 3 sets of identity documents that would allow her to disappear completely if necessary. In the kitchen, disguised as ordinary cooking supplies, were the components for improvised explosive devices and chemical weapons. Her medicine cabinet contained first aid supplies sufficient for treating battlefield injuries, including surgical instruments and military-grade pain medications. Most importantly, hidden behind a panel in her closet, was a secure satellite communication system that could reach any intelligence agency in the world without going through commercial networks. She'd hoped never to use it again, but Marcus's disappearance had changed everything. Carolyn activated the communication system and entered a series of codes she'd memorized 5 years ago, but never expected to need again. The encryption sequence took nearly 5 minutes to complete, but eventually she was connected to a secure server farm located somewhere in the continental United States. A text message appeared on the small screen. "Ghostmark authenticated. State your requirements." She typed quickly. "Require priority intelligence on Fort Wallace ammunition trafficking operation. Personnel involved. Major Thomas Stevens. Minimum 3 additional military. Timeline, active within past 72 hours. Classification level, assume operational security compromised." The response came back within seconds. "Request acknowledged. Intelligence package will be delivered via secure drop in 18 hours. Recommend immediate extraction if cover is blown." Carolyn stared at the screen for a long moment before typing her final message. "Negative on extraction. Personal stakes require mission continuation. Will maintain current identity until operation complete. Understood. Be advised. Ghostmark file was accessed by unauthorized personnel 6 days ago. Assume hostile intelligence has full background information." The implications of that final message sent a chill through Carolyn's entire body. 6 days ago was 3 days before Marcus had reported suspicious activity at the ammunition depot. Someone had been planning this operation specifically around her identity, using her son as leverage to force her out of hiding. This wasn't a random crime, or even a simple case of Marcus witnessing something he shouldn't have seen. This was a carefully orchestrated trap designed to capture or eliminate one of the most dangerous intelligence operatives in American military history. And she was walking straight into it, because the alternative was abandoning her son to whatever fate his captors had planned. As darkness settled over Fort Wallace, Carol made her final preparations. She changed into dark clothing and soft-soled shoes, gear that would allow her to move silently through the base after hours. Into a small backpack, she packed tools that appeared to be maintenance equipment, but could serve double duty as weapons or surveillance gear if necessary. The surveillance team watching her apartment had settled into a routine, rotating positions every 2 hours and maintaining loose coverage of all potential exit routes. Professional, but not perfect. They were probably assuming she would either attempt to leave the base entirely or wait for daylight to continue her investigation. They weren't prepared for a middle-aged cleaning lady to conduct a covert night operation on a military installation. Caroline waited until 2:15 a.m., the period when human attention naturally flagged due to circadian rhythms, then slipped out through her apartment's rear window onto a maintenance walkway that connected several civilian housing units. From there, she was able to reach the base's utility tunnel system without ever appearing in the open where surveillance cameras might detect her. Fort Wallace's underground infrastructure was extensive, a network of steam tunnels, electrical conduits, and communication lines that connected every major building on the base. During her 5 years as a maintenance worker, Carolyn had mapped every inch of the system, officially as part of her job responsibilities, but actually as an escape route in case her cover was ever blown. Tonight, those tunnels would allow her to reach Charlie Ammunition Depot without being detected by either human surveillance or electronic monitoring systems. The journey took 45 minutes, crawling through spaces barely large enough for a human body, and navigating by memory in absolute darkness. When she finally emerged through a maintenance hatch near the depot's perimeter fence, Carolyn was covered in dust and grime, but had successfully bypassed every security measure designed to keep unauthorized personnel away from the installation's most sensitive facilities. Getting inside Building 7 would be more challenging, but not impossible. During her regular cleaning duties, she'd noticed that the building's emergency ventilation system could be accessed through an external maintenance panel that was secured with a standard military lock, the kind she'd learned to pick during her initial intelligence training 20 years ago. The ventilation shaft was a tight fit, but it led directly to the building's main storage area, where Marcus had been conducting his inventory check. Carolyn dropped silently into the darkened space, her eyes automatically adjusting to the low light conditions, while her other senses cataloged every detail of the environment. The ammunition racks stood in neat rows, each one labeled with codes that indicated the type and quantity of ordnance stored there. Everything appeared normal at first glance, but Carolyn's trained eye began picking up anomalies that the official investigators had either missed or chosen to ignore. Scuff marks on the concrete floor that suggested heavy objects had been moved recently. Dust patterns on the ammunition containers that indicated some had been handled more frequently than others. Most telling of all, a faint chemical odor that didn't belong in a properly maintained ammunition storage facility. She followed the scent to a section of the building that supposedly contained standard small arms ammunition, but when she examined the containers more closely, the discrepancies became obvious. The weight was wrong. The boxes were significantly lighter than they should have been if they contained the indicated quantities of ammunition. The serial numbers on several containers had been altered using professional forgery techniques, and the chemical smell was coming from traces of a substance used in the manufacture of plastic explosives. Marcus hadn't discovered a simple case of theft or mismanagement. He'd stumbled onto a sophisticated arms trafficking operation that was using Fort Wallace's legitimate ammunition storage facility as a cover for moving illegal weapons and explosives to unknown buyers. The scope of the operation became clear as Carolyn continued her examination, based on the number of altered containers and the sophistication of the forgery work. This wasn't a small-scale operation run by a few corrupt soldiers. This was a major criminal enterprise that required high-level military access, substantial financial resources, and connections to international arms dealers. It was also exactly the kind of operation that Ghostmark had been created to investigate and destroy. A soft sound from the building's main entrance made Carolyn freeze in place. Footsteps, moving with the careful precision of someone trying not to make noise. Multiple individuals, based on the rhythm and spacing of the steps. They were conducting a security sweep, probably a routine check to make sure the crime scene hadn't been disturbed. Carolyn had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached her location. The ventilation shaft she'd used to enter the building was too far away to reach without being detected, and the ammunition racks didn't provide enough concealment to hide from a thorough search. But Fort Wallace's ammunition storage buildings had been designed with multiple emergency exits to allow personnel to evacuate quickly in case of fire or explosion. Carolyn made her way silently to the rear of the building, where an emergency door opened onto a loading dock that was normally used for ammunition deliveries. The door was secured with an electronic lock that required a military access card, but the system had a manual override that could be activated from inside the building. Carolyn triggered the override and slipped outside, just as the security team's flashlight beams began sweeping the area where she'd been hiding. The loading dock was deserted, but she could hear radio chatter from the direction of the main building entrance. The security team was reporting their findings to someone in command authority, and their tone suggested they'd discovered evidence that the building had been entered by an unauthorized person. Carolyn needed to get back to the tunnel system before they expanded their search to the entire facility, but as she moved toward the maintenance hatch, a voice called out from the darkness behind her. "That's far enough, Mrs. Mitchell." She turned slowly to find Lieutenant Cole emerging from the shadows near the building's loading bay, his service weapon drawn but pointed toward the ground rather than directly at her. His expression was a mixture of suspicion and professional curiosity. "Lieutenant," Carolyn said calmly, "I couldn't sleep, so I decided to take a walk. I hope I'm not violating any base regulations." "A walk that happened to lead you to a restricted military facility in the middle of the night?" Cole's voice carried skepticism, but also something else, a note of respect that suggested he was beginning to understand who he was really dealing with. "I was worried about Marcus," Carolyn replied. "I wanted to see the place where he disappeared, to try to understand what might have happened to him." Cole studied her for several seconds, taking in her dark clothing, the small backpack, and the fact that she'd somehow managed to access a building that was supposed to be under strict security. His next words confirmed that he'd been doing some investigating of his own. "Mrs. Mitchell, I ran a background check on you this afternoon. Officially, Carolyn Mitchell is a 45-year-old widow from Tennessee who's worked as a civilian maintenance contractor for the past 5 years. No military service, no criminal record, no red flags of any kind." He paused, holstering his weapon, but keeping his hand near the grip. "But unofficially, there are some interesting gaps in that background. No employment history before you started working at Fort Wallace. No educational records beyond high school. No credit history, no property ownership, no family connections beyond Marcus. It's almost like Carolyn Mitchell didn't exist before 5 years ago." Carolyn remained silent, recognizing that anything she said at this point would either reveal too much or sound like an obvious lie. "So I started thinking," Cole continued, "about all the little things I've noticed since you arrived at that briefing this morning. The way you move, the questions you ask, the fact that you seem to know more about military procedure than most civilians. And I ask myself, what kind of person has that combination of skills and knowledge?" The moment had come. Carol could continue playing the role of worried mother and hope that Cole's suspicions didn't lead him to the truth, or she could take a calculated risk and bring him into her operation. The decision would affect not only her mission to rescue Marcus, but potentially the lives of everyone involved in the arms trafficking conspiracy. "Lieutenant," she said finally, "how far are you willing to go to find out what really happened to my son?" Cole's expression grew serious. "As far as necessary, ma'am, but I need to know who I'm really talking to." Carolyn reached into her backpack and pulled out a small metallic object that gleamed dully in the moonlight. It was a challenge coin, the kind given to members of elite military units to prove their identity and credentials. But this coin was different from the standard Army, Navy, or Air Force varieties Cole would have seen before. The base of the coin bore the image of a scope crosshair superimposed over a pair of wings, with text around the edge that read, "Delta Force Black Unit." The reverse side showed a single word in simple block letters, "Ghost Mark." Cole's face went pale as he recognized the significance of what he was seeing. Delta Force Black Unit was a classified special operations group that officially didn't exist, composed of intelligence operatives who conducted missions that could never be acknowledged by the American government. Ghost Mark was a legend within special operations community, a female operative who had successfully completed more than 50 classified missions before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. "Holy cow," Cole whispered. "You're her. You're actually her." "I was," Carolyn corrected. "Ghost Mark died 5 years ago in a classified operation that went wrong. Carolyn Mitchell is just a mother trying to save her son. But the skills, the training, the contacts, you still have all of that." "Some of it," Carolyn admitted, "but using those capabilities means revealing my identity to people who have very good reasons for wanting me dead. People who are apparently willing to use my son as bait to draw me out of hiding." Cole looked around the deserted loading dock, suddenly aware that their conversation was taking place in exactly the kind of location where intelligence operatives might be captured or eliminated by hostile forces. "What do you need from me?" he asked. It was the question Carolyn had been hoping to hear, because it meant she'd successfully recruited an ally with legitimate access to military resources and intelligence. But it also meant she was about to put Lieutenant Cole in the same kind of danger that had already claimed Marcus. "I need you to help me find out who's really behind this operation," she said. "And then I need you to help me get my son back before they decide he's too dangerous to keep alive." The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the night air, their engines growing louder as they headed toward the ammunition depot. Someone had apparently decided that the security sweep wasn't sufficient, and they were bringing in additional personnel to conduct a more thorough investigation. "We need to move," Cole said urgently. "If they find us here together, It's going to raise questions that neither of us can answer. But as they prepared to leave the loading dock, Carolyn caught sight of something that made her freeze in place. In the distance, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure standing near the facility's main gate. Even at this range, she could see enough detail to recognize the person's posture and bearing. It was Major Stevens, and he was talking on a secure radio while watching the ammunition depot with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what was happening inside. Stevens wasn't just aware of the investigation into Marcus's disappearance, he was actively coordinating it, which meant the conspiracy ran much deeper than a simple arms trafficking operation, and Marcus was in far greater danger than Carolyn had realized. The hunt for her son was about to become a war. "We need to get out of here now," Cole whispered urgently, but Carolyn held up a hand to stop him. She pulled out what appeared to be a standard maintenance tablet from her backpack, but as she activated the device, it became clear this was no ordinary equipment. The ruggedized screen displayed military-grade encryption software, and within seconds she was accessing the base's security camera network through channels that shouldn't have been available to civilian personnel. "What is that thing?" Cole asked, staring at the sophisticated technology in her hands. "Encrypted tactical tablet," Carolyn replied, her fingers moving rapidly across the interface. "Designed for battlefield intelligence gathering, the reinforced screen can withstand combat conditions, and it maintains satellite connectivity even in high-interference environments where standard civilian devices would fail completely." The tablet's display showed feeds from multiple security cameras throughout Fort Wallace, and Carolyn quickly identified the pattern she was looking for. Stevens wasn't just coordinating the search of the ammunition depot, he was orchestrating a complex operation involving at least a dozen personnel positioned at strategic locations around the base. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the screen. "Stevens has teams stationed at every potential escape route. The main gate, the vehicle checkpoints, even the service roads that most people don't know exist. This isn't a search operation, it's a containment protocol." Cole studied the camera feeds with growing alarm. They're not trying to find Marcus, they're trying to trap someone who might come looking for him. Exactly. And since they activated this protocol after I started asking questions, I think we can safely assume I'm the target they're really after. The sound of approaching footsteps forced them to move from the loading dock toward a maintenance shed that offered better concealment. As they took cover, Carolyn continued monitoring the security feeds, watching as teams of soldiers moved through the base with the precision of a well-rehearsed operation. "How long have they been planning this?" Cole asked. "Based on what I'm seeing, probably weeks, maybe longer. This kind of coordination requires extensive preparation and someone with very high-level access to base operations." A new voice crackled through Cole's radio, cutting through their conversation. "All units, this is Control. We have confirmed unauthorized access to Building 7. Initiate Protocol 7 immediately. All personnel maintain radio silence except for priority communications." Cole and Carolyn exchanged glances. Protocol 7 was a base-wide security lockdown reserved for the most serious threats to national security. It meant that everyone on Fort Wallace, military personnel, and civilians alike, would be confined to their current locations until the situation was resolved. "They're escalating," Carolyn observed, "which means either they've found something that proves I was in that building, or they're getting desperate. Or both," Cole replied grimly. Through her tablet's interface, Carolyn watched as additional teams deployed throughout the base. But one feed caught her attention, a camera positioned near the old underground bunker system that Fort Wallace had used for ammunition storage during the Cold War. The bunkers had been officially decommissioned decades ago, but the camera showed recent activity in an area that should have been completely abandoned. Vehicle tracks in the dirt, fresh footprints near the entrance. And most telling of all, a brief glimpse of someone in military uniform or emerging from one of the bunkers before quickly moving out of camera range. "That's where they're holding Marcus," Carolyn said with certainty. "The old bunker complex. It's perfect. Isolated, underground, and officially off-limits to everyone except maintenance personnel. How can you be sure?" "Because it's exactly where I would hold a high-value prisoner if I wanted to keep them hidden from base security, while maintaining easy access for interrogation or elimination." Cole's radio crackled again. "Lieutenant Cole, report your current location immediately." Cole looked at Carolyn, clearly torn between his duty as a military officer and his growing understanding that the official chain of command had been compromised. "If you answer that radio," Caroline said quietly, "you become part of their operation. Once they know where you are, They can either use you or eliminate you as a potential witness. And if I don't answer, then you're officially AWOL, which means your career is over, but you might live long enough to help me save my son." It wasn't really a choice at all. Cole turned off his radio and removed the battery, effectively cutting his last official connection to Fort Wallace's command structure. "Okay," he said, "I'm in. What's the plan?" The plan, as Carolyn explained it while they made their way through the base's utility tunnel system, was both elegant and extremely dangerous. They would approach the bunker complex from underground, using maintenance tunnels that connected to the Cold War-era facility. Once inside, they would locate Marcus and extract him while documenting evidence of the arms trafficking operation. The dangerous part was that they would be operating without backup, without official authority, and against opponents who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their operation. "One more thing," Caroline said as they crawled through a particularly narrow section of tunnel. "When we find Marcus, he's going to be shocked by what he sees me do. For 19 years, he's known me as his mother, who cleans weapons and worries about his grades. In the next few hours, he's going to discover that his mother is someone completely different. How do you think he'll handle that? I honestly don't know, but I'd rather have him alive and angry with me than dead and proud of who he thought I was." The tunnel system beneath Fort Wallace was even more extensive than most base personnel realized. During the Cold War, the military had constructed an elaborate network of underground facilities designed to protect critical personnel and equipment in case of nuclear attack. Most of these tunnels had been sealed when the base was modernized, but Carolyn's maintenance access gave her knowledge of routes that still connected to the old bunker complex. The journey took nearly 2 hours, crawling through spaces that hadn't been designed for human passage, and navigating by memory in absolute darkness. When they finally reached the access point that led to the bunker system, both Carolyn and Cole were exhausted and covered in decades of accumulated dust and grime. "The entrance should be about 50 feet ahead," Carolyn whispered, "but we need to assume they have security measures in place." She activated her tablet again, this time using it to scan for electronic surveillance devices. The screen showed multiple heat signatures in the bunker complex above them, confirming that the facility was occupied despite its official decommissioned status. "At least 6 individuals," she reported, "probably guards plus whoever's questioning Marcus. The good news is that they're spread out through the complex, which means we might be able to reach Marcus without engaging all of them simultaneously. And the bad news? The bad news is that if this goes wrong, we're 50 feet underground with only one exit and no backup." They emerged into the bunker complex through a maintenance hatch that opened into what had once been a command center. The room was larger than Carolyn had expected, with concrete walls thick enough to withstand a direct nuclear strike, and communications equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. But someone had been using this facility recently. Modern computers sat alongside the vintage equipment, and power cables snaked across the floor to provide electricity for contemporary operations. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was an active command center for whatever conspiracy had resulted in Marcus's disappearance. "Look at this," Cole whispered, pointing to a wall covered with photographs, maps, and documents. "They've been planning something big." The wall contained what appeared to be a complete intelligence breakdown of Fort Wallace's security procedures, personnel assignments, and ammunition storage protocols. But more disturbing were the photographs of individuals who clearly weren't military personnel. Men and women in civilian clothes who appeared to be buyers or dealers in some kind of illegal transaction. At the center of the wall was an organizational chart that made the scope of the conspiracy clear. Major Stevens was listed as Operations Coordinator, but above him were names and positions that extended far beyond Fort Wallace. This wasn't just a local arms trafficking operation, it was part of a network that involved personnel at multiple military installations. And at the very top of the chart, marked with the designation Primary Target, was a photograph of Carolyn Mitchell alongside a file that was labeled simply Ghost Mark. "They've been hunting you," Cole said, staring at the photograph. "This whole arms trafficking operation was just a cover for getting you to reveal yourself." Before Carolyn could respond, a voice echoed through the bunker complex from somewhere deeper in the facility. It was Marcus, and he sounded terrified. "Please, I don't know anything about arms trafficking. I just noticed some inventory discrepancies and reported them like I was supposed to. I don't know who my mother really is." Another voice responded, calm and professional. "Your mother is a very dangerous woman, Private Mitchell. She's responsible for the deaths of several good soldiers, and she's been hiding at Fort Wallace under false identity for 5 years. We know she'll come for you, and when she does, we'll be ready." The voices were coming from a section of the bunker that had probably been used for interrogation during the Cold War. Carolyn and Cole made their way carefully through the complex, using the vintage equipment and concrete pillars for concealment as they approached the source of the conversation. What they found confirmed Carolyn's worst fears. Marcus was secured to a metal chair in the center of a small room, his hands zip-tied behind his back and a visible bruise on his forehead where he'd been struck. 3 men in military uniforms stood around him, and one of them was speaking into a secure radio. "Control, this is Bunker Team. The asset is secure and ready for exchange. Confirm that Overwatch teams are in position for when the target arrives." The response came through clearly. "Confirmed, Bunker Team. Ghostmark has been located at grid reference 77 Alpha. She's moving toward your position with unknown escort. Estimate arrival in 30 minutes. Carolyn realized with a chill that they'd been tracked despite all their precautions. Someone with access to the base's most sophisticated surveillance systems had been monitoring their movements through the tunnel network. But that also meant she had 30 minutes to turn the tables on the people who'd been hunting her for 5 years. "Cole," she whispered, "I need you to create a distraction, something that will draw at least 2 of those guards away from Marcus." "What kind of distraction?" "The kind that makes them think there's been a security breach somewhere else in the bunker complex. Use your radio to send a false report about intruders in the main tunnel system." Cole looked uncertain. "Won't they realize it's fake when they can't verify the report through official channels?" "Not if you make it sound like you're responding to an order from Major Stevens. They'll assume it's part of the operation they're already running." While Cole moved to a position where his radio transmission would sound like it was coming from a different part of the bunker, Carolyn prepared for what she knew would be the most challenging part of the entire operation. She would have to neutralize armed guards, free Marcus, and escape from an underground facility, all while maintaining enough control to avoid seriously injuring American military personnel who might be operating under orders they didn't fully understand. Cole's voice crackled through the bunker's communication system. "Control, this is Perimeter Team Alpha. We have movement in Tunnel Section 4. Request immediate backup at Grid 73 Charlie. Possible hostile infiltration." The response was immediate. 2 of the 3 guards in Marcus's room immediately moved toward the tunnel access points, leaving only one person to watch the prisoner. It was exactly what Carol had hoped for, but it also meant she had only a few minutes before the deception was discovered. She moved silently through the bunker until she was positioned directly behind the remaining guard. The man was focused on his radio, trying to coordinate with the teams that were supposedly responding to Cole's false alarm. He never heard Carolyn approach until her arm wrapped around his throat in a blood choke that rendered him unconscious in seconds. "Marcus," she whispered urgently as she cut his restraints with a tactical knife. "Are you hurt?" Her son looked up at her with a mixture of relief and confusion. "Mom, how did you find me? And how did you get down here?" "I'll explain everything later. Right now we need to get out of here before—" Well, the famous Ghostmark finally shows herself. Major Stevens emerged from the shadows at the far end of the room, his service weapon drawn and pointed directly at Carolyn. Behind him came Colonel Harrison, and Carolyn felt her heart sink as she realized that even the officer she'd hoped might be an ally was part of the conspiracy. "Colonel Harrison," Stevens said without taking his eyes off Carolyn, "I'd like you to meet Master Sergeant Rachel Thompson, formerly of Delta Force Black Unit, also known as Ghostmark, one of the most effective intelligence operatives in United States military history." But Harrison's response wasn't what Stevens had expected. Instead of acknowledgement or satisfaction, the colonel's face showed a mixture of recognition and profound respect. "Everyone stand fast," Harrison said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "You're looking at a soldier who completed more classified missions than anyone in this room, who saved the lives of dozens of American personnel, and who was betrayed by the very system she served." Stevens's weapon wavered slightly. "Sir, this woman is a deserter and a traitor. She stole classified intelligence and disappeared when she was supposed to eliminate witnesses to—" "To what, Major?" Harrison's voice cut through Stevens's explanation like a blade. "To your arms trafficking operation? To the murder of American soldiers who discovered your criminal enterprise? Or to the fact that you've been selling weapons to foreign insurgents for the past 3 years? The revelation hit Stevens like a physical blow. His carefully orchestrated operation hadn't just been discovered. It had been under investigation by someone with the authority to bring down his entire network. You see, Major, Harrison continued, Ghostmark's disappearance 5 years ago wasn't a desertion. It was a deep cover operation authorized at the highest levels of military intelligence. We needed someone on the inside of Fort Wallace to investigate reports of weapons trafficking, and we needed that person to have an identity that would be completely above suspicion. Carolyn stared at Harrison in shock. Sir, that's not... Mrs. Mitchell, Harrison interrupted gently, or should I say Sergeant Thompson, your cover identity was so effective that even you believed it was real. The memory modification therapy was necessary to make your civilian persona completely authentic, but it was always intended to be temporary. The pieces of a puzzle that Carolyn hadn't even known existed began falling into place. Her missing memories from before she'd arrived at Fort Wallace, the perfect documentation that had supported her civilian identity, the way she'd been assigned to maintenance duties that gave her access to every sensitive facility on the base. She hadn't been hiding from her past. She'd been living a carefully constructed legend designed to position her exactly where she needed to be when the arms trafficking operation finally revealed itself. The trigger phrase to restore your complete memory is Operation Blackwater, Harrison said. But before I activate that protocol, I want you to know that everything you felt as Carolyn Mitchell, your love for Marcus, your desire to protect him, your willingness to sacrifice everything for his safety, all of that is real. The mission may have been artificial, but the emotions were authentic. As the phrase Operation Blackwater registered in her consciousness, Carolyn felt a flood of memories rushing back. 5 years of missing experiences, training, mission briefings, and most importantly, the knowledge that Marcus wasn't just her cover identity's son. He was the biological child she'd been forced to place for adoption as an infant because her military career made family life impossible. When the Army had needed someone for the Fort Wallace operation, they had offered her the chance to live the life she'd always wanted while serving her country in the most important way possible. She would get to be Marcus's mother, and she would complete a mission that could save thousands of American lives by shutting down a weapons trafficking network. Holy cow, Marcus whispered, staring at his mother as understanding dawned on his face. You're really her. You're really a Special Forces soldier. Carolyn knelt beside her son, pulling out the Ghostmark challenge coin that had been hidden in her apartment for 5 years. The coin was exactly as she'd described to Cole, except now she remembered that it had been cut in half deliberately. One half bore the Delta Force insignia and her operational code name. The other half had been given to Marcus when he was 7 years old, with instructions to keep it safe until his mother could explain what it meant. You carved Mom into this when you were 7, she said, showing him how the two halves fit together perfectly. I told you it was just a piece of metal I found, but you said it was important because it belonged to me. Marcus pulled an identical half coin from his pocket, the metal worn smooth from years of handling. When he pressed it against his mother's half, the complete Ghostmark insignia was revealed, along with the word family etched around the border. I never forgot, Marcus said simply. Even when I didn't understand what it meant, I knew it was important. Major Stevens, who had been listening to this reunion with growing desperation, suddenly raised his weapon again. This is very touching, but none of it matters. You've all seen too much, and you're all going to have accidents before you can report anything. But Stevens had forgotten about Lieutenant Cole, who emerged from concealment behind him and placed the barrel of his sidearm against the Major's temple. I don't think so, sir, Cole said quietly. Drop your weapon and place your hands on your head. The arrest of Major Stevens and his co-conspirators happened quickly after that. Colonel Harrison activated an emergency communication protocol that brought FBI agents and military police to the bunker complex within minutes. The evidence they found, documents, photographs, communication records, and physical samples of the illegal weapons, was sufficient to expose an arms trafficking network that had been operating at 6 different military installations across 3 states. But the most important discovery was the evidence that Stevens and his network had been responsible for the deaths of 11 American soldiers over the past 3 years, personnel who had discovered various aspects of the trafficking operation and been eliminated to protect the conspiracy. As dawn broke over Fort Wallace, Carolyn and Marcus stood together in the base's main assembly area, watching as the last of the arrested conspirators were loaded into federal transport vehicles. The nightmare that had started with Marcus's disappearance was finally over, but both of them knew that their lives had been fundamentally changed by the events of the past 48 hours. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now," Colonel Harrison said, approaching them with a folder containing official documents, "you both get to decide what kind of life you want to live. The cover operation is complete, the trafficking network has been destroyed, and Sergeant Thompson's real identity can be restored if that's what she chooses." Carolyn looked at the folder, then at her son, then back at Harrison. "What are the alternatives? You can remain Carolyn Mitchell, civilian maintenance worker, and continue living the life you've built here. Your service record will reflect an honorable discharge with full benefits, and your son will never have to worry about the kind of dangers that come with having a parent in special operations. Or you can return to active duty as Master Sergeant Thompson, accept the decorations and recognition that were withheld for security reasons, and help us train the next generation of intelligence operatives. Marcus would be eligible for military academy appointment and could follow in your footsteps if that's what he chooses." It was Marcus who answered first. "Mom, I've spent 19 years knowing you as the strongest, most capable person I've ever met. Finding out that you're also one of the most decorated soldiers in the Army doesn't change that. It just explains where all that strength came from." He paused, looking around at the base that had been their home for 5 years. "But I think I'd like to meet the woman who raised me as much as I'd like to know the soldier who saved me." Carolyn smiled, understanding exactly what her son meant. "Colonel Harrison, I appreciate everything the Army has done for me, and I'm honored to have served. But Carolyn Mitchell isn't just a cover identity anymore. She's who I chose to become. I'd like to keep being her. And the recognition, the decorations, the official acknowledgement of your service, keep the medals. I have everything I need right here." 6 months later, Carolyn stood in the Fort Wallace Armory, training a new group of civilian maintenance workers on proper weapon cleaning procedures. Her student today was Elena Rodriguez, a young woman who'd recently completed her military service and was transitioning to civilian employment. "Remember," Carolyn said, demonstrating the proper technique for checking a rifle's chamber, "every weapon should be treated as if it's loaded, even when you know it isn't. Respect for the equipment keeps everyone safe." Elena nodded, following the procedure exactly as Carolyn had shown her. "Mrs. Mitchell, can I ask you something? Some of the soldiers say you used to be in special forces. Is that true?" Carolyn smiled, continuing to clean the rifle with the same methodical precision she'd always shown. "Elena, I've learned that who you used to be matters less than who you choose to be every day. I choose to be someone who takes care of the tools that keep our soldiers safe. But if you were special forces, why would you choose to work as a cleaner?" "Because," Carolyn said, setting down the rifle and looking directly at her student, "sometimes the most important job in the world is making sure that someone else can do theirs." As Elena returned to her work, Carolyn's phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from an unknown number. "Ghost Mark, we have a situation developing overseas. American hostages. Your skills are needed. Will you consider one more mission?" Carolyn looked at the message for a long moment, then at the peaceful scene around her. Soldiers training, equipment being properly maintained, young people like Elena learning valuable skills for their civilian careers. She thought about Marcus, who was now studying logistics and supply chain management at a nearby college, and about the quiet life they'd built together. Then she typed a short response. "Ghost Mark is retired, but if American lives are at stake, Carolyn Mitchell might be willing to consult on security procedures." She deleted the message thread and put her phone away. Outside the armory windows, she could see Marcus approaching for their weekly lunch together, his face bright with the enthusiasm of someone sharing good news. "Mom," he called out as he entered the building, "I got accepted for the summer internship with the State Department. They said my background in military logistics and my understanding of security protocols made me an ideal candidate." Carolyn hugged her son, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that all the sacrifices, all the secrets, and all the years of living in the shadows had led to this moment. Marcus was safe, successful, and proud of the woman who had raised him, and that was worth more than any medal or recognition the Army could ever offer. As they walked out of the armory together, heading for their lunch date, Carolyn's phone buzzed one more time. She ignored it, focusing instead on her son's excited description of his new internship and his plans for the future, Some missions never really ended. They just transformed into something more important than the original objective. And sometimes, the most successful operations were the ones where victory looked exactly like an ordinary life lived with the people you loved most. The Ghostmark file would remain classified, but the story of Carolyn Mitchell, mother, mentor, and guardian of those who served, would continue for as long as there were weapons to clean, students to teach, and a son who needed to know that he was the most important mission his mother had ever completed.
Thank you for being part of our EV story. Here, we tell story about simple women with hidden strength and deep courage. So, if story inspire you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. We will see you in the next story.